When I first played through Cartethyia story, I have to admit that I didn't really pay much attention, because I focus a lot more on the gameplay than the story itself.
Furious tides! Split the heavens!
Holy fuck, did you just clear 3 waves? This was at a time when I didn't really pay much attention to the lore of Wuthering Waves of story, but after the 2.5 update, I've been going back to some of the more standout parts of recent characters to essentially reassess my opinions. And of course, the first place I have to look is a character I quite literally saved a year's worth of grinding and not pulling banners just to see 6. So today we're going to be talking about the symbolism of Cartethyia. It's the story that, after some reconsideration and a reanalysis, I feel I didn't really do enough justice on my first run playing, because there was actually a lot of symbolism that I missed that I'm only seeing after actually watching and reanalyzing the story. I am aware, of course, that the reason why Cartethyia is the most popular character in the history of the game is because half the people that pulled want to get dommed by an 8-foot tall elf mommy, but that aside, there is a lot of symbolism and references in her story, much more than I gave it credit for. So, as always, I hope you find this interesting, learn something, or maybe even use this video to comfort yourself on the value of maybe your financial decisions, or whatever, right? Spoilers ahead. Throughout history, knighthood has basically been forcefully tied to nobility. Not only was knights' equipment exorbitantly expensive, but it was seen that the mannerisms, the dignity, the chivalry of a knight was something that was socially inaccessible to the lower classes. It was not just the armor, horse, and lance that made you a knight, but also the pride, the sense of duty, and the supposed selflessness of one. It is this background that makes a legend like Joan of Arc and Cartethyia so legendary, because both of them are chosen by divinity or God as salvation against the calamity. Both of them come from humble origins, with Joan of Arc coming from a village and Cartethyia being a normal girl who once lived in Eglatown. Her story itself says it best. Yet, to everyone's surprise, she was chosen by the divinity. Why her? Some questioned. She was only the daughter of an official, a peasant girl lacking discipline. Not a drop of noble blood ran in her veins. How would she ever come to understand the hierarchies of the world? In this, we see how, as God or divinity are above humanity, it is their will that has allowed a character like Cartethyia or Joan of Arc to bypass the social limitations of knighthood. However, this naturally does not come without a price. Both of them become the Blessed Maiden, who seem to hold the duty of the world on their shoulders as they head off to battle, as the story goes. As Fleur, she must march to war with a sword in her hand. And just as Joan of Arc leads a pivotal counterattack at the Siege of Orleans, Cartethyia takes on the duty and burden of protecting the nation against the Dark Tide. Both of them are doomed to eventually fail, with Joan being burned at the stake, or Fleur eventually losing her battle against the Frenodian. In a parallel with Joan of Arc, Cartethyia is able to expose the unspoken price of divine knighthood. Because being above humanity means that you are also no longer seen as human, as Cartethyia is forced to keep her name and old self, which is symbolic of her wants, dreams, and innocence, hidden from the world. She can only watch as she is deified as she takes divinity's crown. But becoming a deity, a symbol, a hero, is something that necessitates the stripping of her humanity. As she is deified in much the same manner in which we now canonize Joan of Arc as a saint, Cartethyia bids farewell to grain fields swaying in the breeze, to tumble yaks roaming so free, to what, while sounding so simple and innocent, is symbolic of her dreams, of her humanity itself. In the end, she herself says it best. In a world so vast, someone must take up the sword. Someone must bind themselves to thorns. Someone must accept the weight of responsibilities. Someone must become Fleur de Lis, the guardian of Renacita.
Divinity, suffer my disobedience!
In what is essentially the most obvious piece of symbolism in Cartethyia's stories so far, her alternate form of Fleur de Lis is named after French fleur de lis, or flower of the lily, which itself comes from either the lily or the iris. As one of the most important symbols of the French medieval period, it is in itself indicative of many things. But for the sake of clarity, we'll be a bit specific here, because for most of French history, and we're talking old, really old French history, like even before the reign of Charlemagne, the fleur de lis was intensely tied to kingship. From basically the days of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty, the legend goes that French kings were anointed with the holy ampulla, which was emblazoned with the fleur de lis. And then you have to combine that with the fact that French kings, and basically most medieval kings in extension, believed in the divine right of kings, in that they were chosen to rule by God, and that they had a responsibility to not only serve God, but basically build the physical manifestation of the kingdom of heaven on earth. So across a couple of centuries, you get this understanding that the fleur de lis is a symbol that connotes divine right and duty, and that is something, as you can probably imagine, that is completely parallel to Cartethyia. Her clothing incorporates much of the symbol, and her alternate form is quite literally called Fleur de Lis, or Fleur de Lis. She is chosen by divinity, and she must take on a duty that mirrors the responsibility of a king. In order to fulfill the Order's ambitions of preserving Renacita, which you can argue is essentially the physical manifest of the kingdom of heaven, Cartethyia gives up everything to fulfill her duty. However, the symbolism of the fleur de lis goes a little bit beyond just simple notions of duty. As her existence is a duality between Cartethyia and Fleur de Lis, we see that the Fleur de Lis is something that splits her character into two distinct components: the Blessed Maiden, who is cursed to forever fulfill her divine duty, and the young girl with dreams and aspirations she must suppress. At the end of the story, as Cartethyia gains autonomy and agency, it is for this reason that she chooses not to succeed the name of Fleur de Lis, but to live as Cartethyia, the person she was born as a human to be. This doesn't mean that Cartethyia entirely rejected her Fleur de Lis persona, of course, because we know they reconcile the end of the story. Even though Cartethyia remains the more true, dominant persona, we can see that she still wears the Fleur de Lis on her clothes, and her new destiny as a wandering knight is an amalgamation of not only her childhood dreams, but also the sense of duty that Fleur de Lis imparted upon her. Similar to how for Frollover's story, the text of reference is essentially Dante's Purgatorio, Cartethyia's story also has a sort of trademark text of its own that really just defines and relates to everything about her character. This, of course, is the infamous Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, a story about an old nobleman from a village who, after reading stories of the olden days of knights and chivalry, decides to don armor and a weapon, riding his old horse Rocinante to have imaginary fairy tale adventures as a wandering knight. Despite the story being set in 17th century Spain, where knighthood and chivalry had already become relics of the past, the old nobleman adopts the name Don Quixote, and with a poor farmhand called Sancho Panza as his squire, He sets out on imaginary adventures despite everyone else around him deeming him insane. In essence, Don Quixote, which is probably one of the most important stories in the history of literature, is a story that thematically focuses on the divide between idealism and realism. The two main characters, Quixote and Sancho, are basically physical representations of these two concepts. Quixote is a dreamer in an imaginary world of knights and chivalry, and Sancho is a realist who cares about the present, the now, and where his next meal is going to be coming from. This is an important distinction to make because, as we talked about prior, nearly everything about Cartethyia and her story is influenced and inspired by Cervantes' work in some way. For instance, after you look between the lines, it becomes clear that Cartethyia and her alter ego, Fleur, play both the role of Quixote and Sancho. It actually surprised me how much homage Curo ended up paying to Cervantes' Don Quixote when, upon looking back, rewatching and rereading a lot of Cartethyia story, you realize that Cervantes' story is everywhere. For instance, if you check the story in our Experiences tab, The Knight's Fated Hours, it's something that directly parallels to Don Quixote. Once upon a time, in the countryside of Eglatown, there was a wandering knight. With sword in hand, he journeyed far and wide in search of a legendary giant. A giant who stood as tall as a windmill, with arms long and slender like its blades. Time after time, the wandering knight fought with everything he had against the giant, but the giant never spoke a word, only ever waving its arms, rendering the knight's attacks futile. This story is a direct reference to Don Quixote, who attacks a windmill, mistaking it as an evil giant in Chapter 8. Quixote says, "For look, my friend, dirty or more monstrous giants present themselves," to which his squire, the realist Sancho, replies, "What we see there are not giants, but windmills." And, in charging at said windmills, Quixote is pushed off his horse and collapses. You can see that the legend of the Wandering Knight in Cartethyia's story is a direct parallel to Don Quixote, because if we keep reading her story, it continues in the following. Some mocked the knight's foolishness, some pitied his delusion. After all, that so-called giant was nothing more than a windmill, and his battles were but a fantasy. But the countryside's most mischievous girl saw it differently. She found herself a knight's helmet and begged the dramatist for a small wooden sword. To fight for such a giant, she said, he must possess a heart of pure nobility. Riding flamboyantly on a tumbleyak, she raced through the wheat fields. The world had never felt so vast. This was where the blessed maiden's legends began. Through the fields, through the festivities, and into the inverted tower. It would be a grand quest. In this, we can see that Cartethia's childhood, playing pretend as a knight upon her tumbleyak, is a direct allusion to Quixote and his old horse Rocinante. Cartethia's true self represents unbridled dreams and innocence, where her strict values and beliefs are defined by her idealism. The saying, tilting at windmills, is in itself symbolic of not just fighting imaginary enemies, but of immense idealism. This side of Cartethyia, I think, that represents this, is something not only shown in a chaotic childhood of running through fields, but also when she takes on her quest of stemming the dark tide, of fulfilling her never-ending duty of walking the path of thorns. I think there is nothing that emphasizes this more than her own words when she says,
"The righteous will always rise to defeat evil. I will defeat you, and await my own defeat."
Just as how Cartethia's true self is emblematic of Quixote, her alter ego Fleur contrasts this by basically being a representation of Sancho, who echoes reality and disillusionment. As we know, Cartethyia did not exactly have a fun childhood after her destiny was decided. In her story experience called Hesitation Amidst Gale and Tide, we see how Cartethyia's duty as Fleur, such as delivering medicine, stopping TDs, and listening to confessions, were no different from the duties of the knights she had imagined as a child. But now, the difference was that her imagination began to be increasingly tinged by reality. Cartethyia grew increasingly disillusioned with the corruption within the order, but could do nothing but tighten her grip on her sword. In her story, Yet Within Solitude, we see this shift from idealism to reality even more clearly, when she says that each time she raised her sword, she did not care about the past. She only cared about what needed to be done at that very moment. As Fleur gradually loses her memories through the corruption from the Frenodian in the Inverted Tower, we can see how she, like Sancho and Don Quixote, is reduced to only caring about the present and the now, as realism overtakes both her imagination and her past. In a sense, she, like Don Quixote in Cervantes' original work, is doomed to have her idealism crushed by the overwhelming weight of her reality. However, luckily for us, Rover, which we will talk about later in the video, don't worry, arrives to interrupt her decline and save her through the 2.2 story. And this is where the parallel of Cartethyia in Don Quixote gets really interesting. Because as we said before, Cervantes' Don Quixote ends as a bit of a tragedy, as the titular main character wakes up, breaks from his fantastical imagination, and dies soon thereafter. However, Cartethyia is not Quixote, nor is she Sancho. She is both. In the very first story chapter, we've already seen that she is not the wandering knight that tilts and windmills, but the girl who's inspired by the one she does. She is not Don Quixote, but his successor. And as Cartethyia and Fleur make amends and merge together to become one whole again at the end of the story, she makes her idealism a reality. Even in an age which no longer needs knights, she will be the wandering knight-errant that Don Quixote always wanted to be, not only in name, but in action.
Oh, really?
Huh?
We've heard this dusty old story 1,000 times. Boring.
It's a wonderful story.
Thank you. But it's fallen out of favor these days. No one cares about a knight's tale. Best be heading home, young lady.
Cartethyia's crown, which is depicted as a crown of thorns, is a very interesting piece of symbolism, because it takes inspiration from what I think is many places. For instance, if we look at classical and neoclassical imagery, of which Septimon and Rinascita are basically completely designed around, we see that the thorn crown comes from the laurel wreath, which has Greco-Roman roots to victory and divinity, which were in turn inspired by the olive leaf wreaths that were awarded to winners in the first Greek Olympics. In these competitions, the Greeks and later the Romans, after they took over, competed for essentially arete, which is a Greek word which sort of translates roughly to excellence, even on a level comparable to the gods. As such, since the laurel wreath came to symbolize victory and divinity, priestesses and Roman emperors began to wear it, which does parallel with Cartethyia, because as we already know, she is chosen by divinity, and she also has a duty almost equal to that of a king. The issue of this, of course, is that Cartethyia's crown is made of thorns rather than laurels. In this idea, we need to turn away slightly and look to Jesus. Yes, that Jesus. As we've established, the laurel wreath was meant to represent arete, to represent power, to represent divinity. It was a piece to be worn by emperors and kings. So as Jesus was the king of the Jews, the wreath of thorns which was placed on him before his crucifixion has an inverse symbolism of mockery of that of the fall of a king. However, this of course has naturally become canonized in Christianity as a symbol of sacrifice, of undergoing pain for a greater cause. As Cartethyia gives up her own being to take on the role of Fleur, suffering in silence within the tower to stop the Frenodians' cataclysm from falling on Renacita, her wreath stays upon her head, as silent as her suffering. In spite of this terrible symbolism, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Cartethyia's signature weapon, the Defier's Thorn, revamps this symbol of suffering into one of redemption. At the end of the story, once Cartethyia is finally free, the weapon's description reads quite plainly that the knight has crafted the crown of thorns into her weapon, that she is unburdened by the crown that defined her fate. As Cartethyia says herself in what, I think at least, is her coolest line ever, she has rejected the duty of pain that Divinity has imposed upon her, and she will make them suffer her disobedience.
Fear is to be expected. But fear is all it is. To let it stop me is an excuse. If I embrace it, I will break free. A false knight like me needs no armor to shield her, nor a white horse to carry her past. Now, with this sword bestowed upon me, I shall bring the dawn to all! Whatever past lingers, whatever future calls, from now on, every moment ahead shall forever be free of the abyss!
One of the most interesting ways Cartethyia's symbolism intersects with her moveset and her kit is through how her forte circuit works, through the summoning of her 3 sword shadows. Throughout the story of 2.2, you work to recover the 3 of Cartethyia's swords in order to gain access to the tower to eventually meet Fleur. They are Tiravine, the Sword of Divinity, Hognus, the Sword of Discord, and Haltier, the Sword of Virtue. Each of these swords are owned or linked by different people. For instance, Divinity has the energy of Imperator, and represents Cartethyia's divine mission to stop the Dark Tide and save Renacita as a blessed maiden. Basically what we talked about in the Joan of Arc section, right? And then we have Discord, which has the energy of the Leviathan, and that represents her duty to suffer in stopping the Dark Tide from falling Renacita, which we covered in a section on the Wreath of Thorns. Finally, we have the Sword of Virtue, and this is interesting because this is Cartethyia's own personal sword, which represents her dreams and aspirations, much like what we covered in the Don Quixote section. It's not an exaggeration to essentially say that each of Cartethyia's sword shadows represents a part of her. When you place each of the swords within their pedestal to recover Cartethyia's memory, each of them provides a parallel vision that reflects the nature of the swords. One of the duty of divinity, one of the cost of discord, and one of the idealism of virtue. In the end, Cartethyia sacrifices herself to become Arrow Rover's signature sword, Bloodpack's Pledge, a sword that combines the design of all 3 of Cartethyia's swords. And in her kit itself, we see that her forte circuits, all 3 of the swords are needed to essentially buff and charge her ultimates. In this, we see that, in the end, despite discovering that her life and duty was essentially all a fabrication of the Frenodian, Cartethyia has picked up the pieces, whether it be divinity, discord, or virtue, to find a new path. Recently, I watched a video that made the case that a lot of Wuthering Waves' story and concepts have been inspired by Jung's philosophy, which got me thinking quite a bit about how it may relate to Cartethyia's story, especially when it came to finding herself and understanding when she was trapped in the inverted tower. Specifically, Carl Jung's psychological archetypes merit some discussion. In this, Jung proposes that a person's psyche is made up of 4 major archetypes. The first, the persona, is the facade that people present to the world. The second, the shadow, is someone's true self or the repressed side of one's personality. The anima and the animus are the mental components of the opposite gender in one's psyche. When you combine all of these together, you get the 4th archetype, very aptly called the self, which is a sort of combination of the previous 3. The process of unification of these components into the self is roughly translated into another one of Jung's concepts called individuation. Individuation is a process where people become distinct and different, basically, and it's where Jung believes you have to unify and resolve a lot of the conflicting aspects of your psyche. So, for example, you may recognize and integrate your shadow archetype, or you might want to resolve the opposites of your anima and your animus. Whatever, right? Basically, you can kind of see how this already goes into an understanding of Cartethyia and her story, with stuff like how she merges with Fleur, how she essentially accepts her shadow to undergo a process of individuation, stuff like that. However, I want you to just hold your horses for a moment, because there's at least 2 more concepts we have to go through before we finish this part, and I hope that by the time we get to the end, it'll all make sense. So we talked about Jung's theories on psychology, and it's not only because of the fact that Cartethyia's story is linked to a lot of these components, but also because of tarot cards. Because tarot cards are actually very strongly linked to Jungian psychology. Jung himself said in 1953 that they were basically just representations of his theory of archetypes. If we break down, for example, the 22 cards of the major arcana, we can see that they talk about the journey of the Fool as a Sikh self-betterment. Arcana 1 to 5, otherwise known as a path of the child, represents the ego or one's self. Arcana 6 to 10, the path of the everyman, represents the person. Arcana 11 to 15, the path of the hero, represents the shadow. Arcana 16 to 20, the path of the sage, talks about the anima and the animus. And finally, Arcana 21, the world, represents the final individuation, represents wholeness and completion. So if you're wondering why the fuck I just went through every major tarot card and linked them to Jungian theories, and I am still not talking about Cartethyia, I need you to hold on for a second, just a little bit more, because we need to focus on one specific card, which is Arcana 16, the Tower. The Tower is a tarot card which I believe is what really inspires the whole concept of the Avenolium and the inverted tower that Cartethyia and Fleur were trapped in when they were fighting the Dark Tide. When I was first thinking of what the actual map that Cartethyia's story takes place in could actually symbolize, I first thought of Rapunzel. You know, a blonde girl gets trapped in a tower, it's pretty understandable to make that connection, right? The 2 problems with interpreting the map through the lens of Rapunzel is, 1, Rapunzel isn't exactly fighting a giant fucking sea dragon Leviathan, and 2, Rapunzel doesn't really explain the symbolic significance of the gravity mechanics in the map, as well as the state of the inverted tower. So I thought for a while on what the hell the map could actually mean, and then it finally clicked. Arcana 16, or the Tower, is a tarot card that usually depicts a tower being struck by lightning or under some other sort of calamity. In Cartethyia story, we see a parallel as basically the inverted tower is under siege by the dark tide. If Fleur ever loses her battle, the tower will fall from the sky and essentially destroy Renacita. When the tarot card is placed upright, it can symbolize change, chaos, trauma, all of which are relevant to what the Avenolium basically is. It's a battlefield where Fleur fights against the dark tide. The tower in Tarot, as well as the Tower of Babel in the Bible, are all also built on poor foundations. Just like how the tower in Tarot is doomed to fall, Fleur is only able to buy time when she fights. She, too, will eventually fail. But as the name suggests, and as what the gravity mechanics in the map actually show, this meaning is something that can be changed when Rover enters a scene. And if you didn't know, tarot cards don't just have one meaning. You can actually flip them around and almost make the opposite true. In the case of Arcana 16, the inverted tower symbolizes resisting change or of stopping disaster, and this is probably going to start sounding rather familiar. So we have to kind of understand, based on everything that we just talked about, that everything about the map, about how the tower is a space for Cartethyia to find herself and to confront her shadow, or otherwise in Jung's words, to undergo individuation, or even how the inverted tower and the Avenolium in extension are a battlefield where Fleur resists the calamities of the dark tide, everything fits together under these principles. It's all linked together, from Carl Jung to tarot cards to Arcana 16 and the Tower. If you even, for example, remember, Arcana 16 to 20 is a Path of the Sage, which talks about uniting the anima and the animus, similarly to how Cartethyia and Philodilus unite at the end of the story. One of the symbolic references I did not expect, nor did I pick up at all on my first playthrough of this quest, was the links between Cartethyia's story and Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. In the interest of time, I'll just quickly summarize the play, because of course we don't have all day. The story is about this wizard called Prospero. He was originally the Duke of Milan, and if I recall correctly, he's basically banished this sort of castaway kind of island. And in order to exact revenge, because he knows magic, he conjures up a storm, i.e. the Tempest, and shipwrecks and traps the people who wronged him in the past in order to essentially redeem himself. And basically, through a series of events, he's able to fix the situation, he's able to redeem himself, and he's able to look forward to a new future. And you can probably see how there's some parallels between, of course, the plot of The Tempest and Cartethyia story, in that, in both of these stories, it's about someone being trapped in a place in a situation, and about redemption and eventually restoring order. And I have to admit that I almost cut this section out of the video, because during my theory crafting on this connection, let's just say, between The Tempest and Cartethyia's story, I was for some reason quite stubborn in thinking that Rover was Prospero for some reason. I actually really don't fucking know why. I'm still kicking myself over that, by the way, because I spent about 3 hours thinking about what the hell this could mean, and I finally realized while taking a shit that the answer to this puzzle, let's just say, was really staring me in the face. Because if you understand, or if you have even read The Tempest, when we are relating Cartethyia's story to Shakespeare's The Tempest, and we match the characters together, we can see that Rover isn't the main character. They're not Prospero, right? This was always Cartethyia's story. She is Prospero, right? Arrow Rover literally says during their ultimates,
I am the Tempest!
If we relate this to Shakespeare's The Tempest, we realize that Rover isn't actually representative of a character, because they are the storm itself. Similar to how in Shakespeare's play, the Tempest serves as a catalyst of change for Prospero to transform his situation and just get the fuck off the island. In Cartethyia's story, Rover is also the storm that breaks a sort of deadlock. Because while Flordelis is locked in a losing stalemate against a Frenodian, she realized that she had to find something, someone, to end the battle. And that someone was Rover. Cartethyia says herself that her plan all along was to find someone strong enough to kill Flordelis and a Frenodian alongside her. In essence, in this story that has gone on for far too long, Rover is not the main character. They are not Prospero, because they are the Tempest, the one that brings the winds of change. Thanks, as always, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, maybe learned something, maybe even now enjoy the story of Cartethyia just a little bit more. For all of you who permanently play the game in her Resonance Liberation form, Flordelis, perhaps you now know that that is something that probably makes her a little bit sad. All in all, I do appreciate that if you got this far in the video. Very much appreciate it, as always. I'm probably going to be making another one of these, maybe before Augusta and Iono comes out, but for now, here lies the story of Cartethyia.